Good morning, everyone. My name is Manav, and I'm going to be talking about my research regarding the correlation with task complexity and academic procrastination. So first, it's important to address what is academic procrastination. According to the Future Medical Education Journal, procrastination is when students postpone completion of any task, whether that be an activity, a project, or an assignment, unnecessarily. And what this shows is that when we procrastinate, we have an option of doing our task. However, we're voluntarily choosing to procrastinate, even though we'll know that we will suffer as a result. And as we see here, this individual has a lot of work to do. However, they're choosing to disregard that work and instead to focus on entertainment. Now that we talked about what is procrastination, now let's talk about why do we need to talk about academic procrastination. According to the Psychology Journal, about half of the entire student population faces academic procrastination. This is no big deal. This is no small deal because although it's only half of the student population is made up of millions and millions of individuals, meaning this affects so many individuals throughout our society. And now it's important to talk about what are the consequences that procrastination has on the individuals that choose to procrastinate. First, there are definitely many academic repercussions, and according to the Australian Psychologist Journal, some of the consequences of procrastination are that there is significant negative correlation between self-reported procrastination and final coursework, showing that procrastination is detrimental to academic performance. And procrastination also has health impacts. According to the JAMA Network Open Journal, some of the consequences of procrastination include symptoms of depression, anxiety, loneliness, stress, reduced life satisfaction, general health problems, cardiovascular disease, and unhealthy lifestyle behaviors. And so we see that not only does procrastination have many negative impacts on one's personal health and on the academics, but this doesn't only affect a few people, it affects half of the entire student body. Now let's talk about the scholarly work that's been done so far regarding procrastination and how to combat it. So some of the common themes that have appeared are conscientiousness, which is one's tendency or desire to perform a task well or thoroughly. When a student is desiring perfection, when feels they're unprepared to do so right now, they might choose to procrastinate. Next is self-efficacy, which is one's belief in their own abilities. When a student has low self-efficacy, they aren't confident in their abilities, meaning that they'll push off the task because they feel they are not equipped to do the task. Next is fear of failure, in which if a student feels that they cannot achieve a good result on a task, they'll choose to avoid that task, whether that be temporarily, being procrastination, or altogether, meaning disregarding the task. Next is the idea that procrastination is not a symptom of laziness, rather it's a stress response. And this is because when somebody procrastinates, they choose to avoid the stimulus that is causing stress, which is the task itself. And this is because the task is stress-inducing, not because the student is feeling like not doing their task or because they're feeling symptoms of laziness. And while these factors are important, meaning conscientiousness, self-efficacy, fear of failure, and stress response, these factors are all internal traits. However, there's no external stimulus that can possibly guide these internal responses. And while this may seem to be okay, it's not okay because, as we know, when somebody is a stressful person, they're not constantly demonstrating stressful behavior. Rather, they only demonstrate it when an event or stimulus is perceived as stressful. Similarly, there must be a stimulus or an external event that triggers these internal responses that leads to procrastination. So I think that external cue might be task complexity. And according to Lu and Liu, who are both professors of industrial engineering and management, they define task complexity as one's subjective experience and perception of a task and its task characteristics. So what this means is one's perception of task and its complexity may be based off of how many skills are assessed in that task, how much time the task requires, how much time they actually have, whether there's collaboration required, and how many things they have to juggle at the same time. So this leads to my research question, which is there a positive correlation between perceived task complexity and academic procrastination in the high school student population. And to focus on the methodology, initially I came up with 3 options I had, one being case study, but while a case study allows for an in-depth observation of a small group of individuals, the problem is, since it's a small group of individuals, these results cannot be generalized to the entire population. Next, I have a survey, which allows for a larger sample size. However, this method is more prone to response bias, in which students provide responses that they think they should, or they feel like they are expected to provide. Next, and they also are prone to social desirability bias, in which respondents provide responses that look good on them. So if I ask students about procrastination, they are less likely to say that they procrastinate because procrastination is seen as connotative. Next is an experiment. While it does not allow for a sample size as large as a survey, it allows for a decent sample size that the results can be generalized to the population. And since an experiment is done within a controlled environment, it helps to reduce response and social desirability bias, because students are not self-reporting their procrastination behaviors, rather they are demonstrating the normal behavior in which I observe to provide a conclusion regarding their procrastination. So I chose an experiment since it allows for a decent sample size and reduces bias. And in this experiment, I had a sample of 30 high school students from our own high school, and each student was provided 2 separate tasks, and with these 2 tasks, they were asked to provide a score or a rank regarding how complex they thought the test was, and then I measured how far or how much they procrastinated, or whether they didn't procrastinate, or whether they procrastinated at all. Then I had to find a correlation between them. To go more in depth, it was important to do a significance test in order to demonstrate whether the correlation that was found is significant or not. And in order to do this, I had to assess the hypotheses from the beginning. The HO, which is the null hypothesis, states that there's no difference in the procrastination measures between the more and less complex tasks. For the alternate hypothesis, it states that the procrastination measure for the more complex task was greater than the procrastination measure for the less complex task. Okay, for the experimental procedure, since we know that each student was provided with 2 separate tasks, the tasks were provided in separate sessions, and the only difference between the sessions was that the task was different. But these 4 criteria were the same. First, I provided the students with directions regarding what tasks they had, whether it was multiple choice or if it was essay. Then I provided how much time they had for the task, which is 1 period. And then I provided information regarding how much time the actual task required. From those directions, I asked students to rank the complexity based off of how hard they think or how complex they think the task would be. Next, I announced that the session would start, and students could choose to start their task if they wish. And 4 students had to come up to me to receive their materials, and I would calculate their procrastination measure based off of when they started and when the session started. For data analysis, the first thing I had to do was for each student, I had to determine their procrastination measures for both their complex and less complex tasks. Then I had to determine which task was the control group and which one was the experimental group. Third, I had to demonstrate the difference between the procrastination measures. Lastly, I had to use inferential statistics to see if there was a significant correlation. So I'm going to go through an example of how I did data analysis for one student. This procedure is the same for all students. So to determine the procrastination measure in student task 1, I saw that student chose to start at 11:35, but the session was announced to start at 11:30. So the procrastination measure was measured by subtracting 11:30 from 11:35, which gets a procrastination measure of 5 minutes. Similarly, I calculated a procrastination measure of 20 minutes for the second task. To determine the control versus experimental group data, I had to look at the complexity score of the task. Since I saw that for task 2, the student had a higher complexity score, it shows that this was their experimental data and the 20 minutes was their experimental procrastination measure. For task 1, this was a control group and 5 minutes was the control procrastination measure. To find the difference, I had to take for each student this occurred, and for example, for student 1, I took their experimental procrastination measure of 20 minutes subtracted by the control measure of 5 minutes to get a difference of 15 minutes. Okay. Then after finding the difference for each student, I had to create a table with all the students' data from 1 through 30, because there's 30 participants. And then from here, I could calculate the mean difference, the the median difference, as well as the p-value, which is needed for statistical analysis. Findings. These are the range of scores of the differences in procrastination for each student. We see over here the minimum is -11 and the maximum is +15. While negative scores indicate that the student procrastinated less on the more complex tasks, positive values indicate that students procrastinated more for the more complex tasks. And we see 75% of the students procrastinate more on the more complex tasks than they did on less complex tasks, as we see by this data, which shows 25% of the data, 25%, and the last 25%, which are all in the positive range. Okay. Summary statistics, we see that we have a sample size of 30 students. Our mean difference is about 5. Standard deviation, meaning how much the data varies from each other, is about 7. The minimum was -11 minutes, median was 7 minutes, and the maximum was 15 minutes. And it's also important to remove outliers because outliers can skew the results and can lead to false conclusions. But when I used the 1.5 times IQR rule, a statistical measure, I saw that there were no outliers. Inferential statistics. The p-value, or the probability of getting the mean difference of 5 as strong as 5, purely by chance, was merely 0.00033,453, which shows that's really small, meaning chance was not a major factor, and the difference in procrastination measures was due to the task complexity. Similarly, we see the p-value is so small, it's smaller than the commonly accepted alpha value of 0.05, that we reject HO and have evidence for HA, meaning for more complex tasks, students procrastinate more. Conclusion. We found that there is a positive correlation between task complexity and academic procrastination due to the significance test, and we can take this a step further to say that higher task complexity leads to academic procrastination because of the fact that we use random assignment in which I determine which tasks to administer first and which to administer second, shows that the order in which they were administered does not have an effect. Limitations. First, my sample only included students from our high school due to the fact that there were scheduling conflicts, as well as I wanted to administer the experiment during an actual academic setting. So I can only use students from our high school, which shows that the sample was only included from some students, and this is only a subset of the entire population. And since it's only a subset, it means that the students who weren't given a chance to participate, they might have different behaviors than the students who did. Next is lack of consequence. We all know that a major motivator for producing good academic work is the fact that there are consequences for your actions, whether it be current academics, future academics, or your career path. However, due to the fact of ethics, I could not implement consequences on one's grades, which means that some students might have demonstrated different behaviors, and meaning that they were less serious about the experiment because there was nothing that I could do to help reinforce the fact that they need to do the work. Next is peer influence. Since the students were sitting next to each other and close to each other, their rank or their perception of task complexity and the procrastination were likely affected by their peers. Future directions. Now that we know that task complexity is or can be a cause of academic procrastination, academic institutions and teachers can help teach students effective methods on how to cope with task complexity. One may be task division, in which students learn to divide more complex tasks into smaller, more manageable tasks that don't trigger feelings of stress, which can reduce procrastination and its negative impacts. While that's being done, future research can be focused on what is the most effective method to cope with procrastination, thus increasing the likelihood of actually reducing procrastination. Next, while scholarly articles show that self-efficacy, fear of failure, and stress are related with procrastination, and my research shows task complexity is a cause of procrastination, research can be done regarding whether or not these factors work together, or whether they work together to affect procrastination or whether they're independent. If they're independent, a different solution needs to be done for all. Rather, if they all work together, you can use one solution to break this chain to break procrastination. These are my references. Thank you.
Okay, Manav. How did you evaluate the sources you collected to make sure they would be credible, valid, and reliable? Which sources did you discard and why?
Okay, so one major factor that I focused on was the fact of time and sources being outdated. I didn't use outdated sources because there's much research that shows that behavior and IQ, intelligence, many different academic factors have changed over time. So those outdated sources provide different results than what are true right now. I also had a focus on two perspectives, the scientific and the humanities perspectives, because both are related to education. And I wanted to make sure that both factors were addressed in order to make sure that this topic of procrastination in academics was addressed by both important factors. And I also made sure that my sources were all journal sources and academically approved sources. The reason is, in journal sources, we have research that's been done, and I can also check the credibility of the authors, and to make sure that their sources and their research method are credible rather than external sources that aren't credible.
Good.
How might your conclusions relate to the current body of work in the community or field?
So as we saw before, we've seen that task complexity is external stimulus that can lead to procrastination. And the current body of work was that self-efficacy, fear of failure, and stress, which are internal characteristics, lead to procrastination. So this can show that since the internal and external factors lead to procrastination, there may be a direct link between external stimulus that triggers an internal response that leads to the stress response that is procrastination. And it also leads to the fact that we can find coping mechanisms to deal with task complexity, because prior there was no focus on solution, it was just on the internal factors and how to regulate stress.
If you had 3 more weeks to work on this research question, what additional research strategies would you put into practice?
Some of the additional strategies that I would try to use is, since we saw that one major limitation was the sample restrictions, I would try to enforce a virtual kind of an assessment in which students from all over the globe can participate. And I can create a random sample from these students, so that way there's less chance that there's a discrepancy between the behaviors demonstrated by those who are in our high school who participated and the entire student body. This would make it easier to generalize the findings to the entire population. And we saw the lack of consequences. I would try to do more research regarding ethical ways to implement consequences to elicit similar behaviors that students would elicit during actual academic performances.
I have an additional question. This was a complex task. How much procrastination did you find in yourself as you worked on it?
So I definitely noticed a lot of procrastination. Some of it was valid and some of it was not. And what I mean by this is, one of the major things that I was struggling with was the uncertainty with the task, that I could not foresee a lot of problems that might arise, but to deal with that, I devised a 4-step plan, which is to design a methodology, to do a mental run-through of it, rehearse it, revise it, and then execute it. And this was definitely important, and I'm happy that I did choose to use this method, because at first I was planning on saying that the multiple choice section would be the less complex task because it's objective, but then when I was rehearsing, I definitely noticed that for some students, the essay portion might be less complex due to the fact that it's subjective, and that this was a difference in perspective, and that if I had gone with my initial assumption, then I wouldn't have been able to make the correlation between task complexity and procrastination for the students who didn't share the same views as I did.
Any other questions?